everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a topic that's kind of blown up in the global headlines lately. You've probably seen the recent 2026 World Health Organization alerts, right? The ones regarding a cluster of viral cases linked to that multi-country cruise ship travel incident. Well, today, we're going to strip away all the sensationalism, look directly at the compiled clinical data, and demystify the science, the history, and the absolute reality of what we're actually dealing with. We are talking about hantavirus.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Our agenda today covers the foundational biology of what hantavirus is, its two really distinct global syndromes, the concerning climate connection, a look back at historical outbreaks, and finally, a localized breakdown of past cases in Turkey.
So, Section 1. What is hantavirus? Let's understand the basics.
To really make sense of the headlines, we first have to understand the foundational biology of the virus itself. At its core, hantavirus is a rodent-borne RNA virus. It belongs to the Hantaviridae family. The name actually comes from the Hantan River in South Korea, which is where it was first officially isolated. Now, the absolute most critical thing to understand here is the reservoir. According to clinical data from sources like Guven Hospital, this virus is carried by specific types of rodents, mainly mice and rats. But here is the incredible irony of the whole situation: they are completely asymptomatic carriers. They're perfectly healthy landlords to a microscopic tenant that happens to be highly dangerous to us. They just live with it, entirely unbothered, and naturally excrete it into their environment. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how this microscopic machine operates. Based on Dr. Guven Celebi's clinical presentation, being an RNA virus, it's remarkably well organized into three distinct segments. You've got the L, or large segment, and that codes for the RNA polymerase the virus needs to replicate. Then there's the M, or middle segment. This one codes for the envelope glycoproteins, which basically act like molecular keys that allow the virus to attach to receptors on human cells. And finally, the S, or small segment, which codes for the nucleocapsid protein. It is a highly specialized piece of biology. But, how does it actually make that leap from a mouse into a human host? Well, the transmission route is incredibly specific. It relies almost exclusively on environmental exposure, not human-to-human contact. Here's how it plays out. It starts when the asymptomatic infected rodent excretes the virus through urine, feces, or saliva. They usually leave these secretions in dark and closed spaces, places like barns, basements, or dusty storage rooms. Over time, those secretions dry out completely and turn into fine, microscopic dust particles. The critical moment happens when a person enters that unventilated space and, say, sweeps the floor or just disturbs the dust in some way. Those particles become airborne, the person inhales them, and draws the virus deep into their respiratory tract. Now, while that environmental leap sounds pretty intimidating, it's crucial to note that human-to-human transmission is incredibly rare. The risk remains almost entirely environmental.
Moving on to Section 2, the global impact. Two distinct syndromes.
Okay, so we know how it gets into the body, but what happens next? Depending on where you are on the map, this virus behaves in two drastically different ways. See, hantavirus isn't just one uniform illness. The medical community classifies it into two distinct syndromes based on geography and the specific viral strain. And this all comes down to those viral glycoproteins we talked about earlier, the ones that target different organ receptors. In Europe and Asia, strains like Pumala and Dubrava cause what's called hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, or HFRS. Like the name implies, these strains primarily seek out receptors in the kidneys, causing renal dysfunction and a high fever. It's definitely serious, but the fatality rate is relatively lower, sitting between 5 to 10%. On the flip side, over in the Americas, strains like the Sinn-Nombri virus cause hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS. These strains aggressively target endothelial cells in the lungs, and that leads to severe fluid buildup and severe respiratory distress. This syndrome is significantly more dangerous, carrying a really high fatality rate of around 30%. And because there's currently no universally approved vaccine for either syndrome, supportive care, stuff like fluid replacement and sometimes dialysis, is pretty much the primary medical response.
Section 3, the climate connection. Shifting habitats. Now, you might be wondering, if the virus primarily stays in specific rodent populations, why are we seeing sudden spikes in cases like those recent alerts? Let's look at the data coming out of South America. Recent reports from Reuters and NTV News highlighted a massive outbreak in Argentina, where cases nearly doubled from the previous year. They hit 101 infections and 32 fatalities since 2025. When investigating the cause of this, experts pointed directly to environmental shifts. The environmental data makes it super clear. Rising temperatures are making it way easier for the primary carrier down there, the long-tailed mouse, to expand its habitat into entirely new, previously non-endemic territories. Add to that extreme weather events, like wildfires, which actively force wildlife out of their natural habitats and push them closer to rural urbanization. When you combine uncleared brush, increased tourism in these natural areas, and migrating rodent populations, you are literally creating the perfect recipe for increased human-rodent interaction.
All right, Section 4, Historical Outbreaks. A millennium of data. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds. With all this talk of recent alerts and climate shifts, it's so easy to assume this is some newly mutated modern threat, right? But the clinical literature tells a very different story. It's wild to think that clinical descriptions perfectly matching hantavirus, a fever combined with rapid renal failure, are actually documented in ancient Chinese texts from roughly 1,000 years ago. Our ancestors were dealing with this exact same microscopic machine. Fast forward to the 1950s, during the Korean War, a massive outbreak termed Korean hemorrhagic fever hit over 3,000 soldiers. Field medics of the time suspected it was rodent-borne, but just couldn't prove it. It actually wasn't until 1978 that Dr. Lee officially isolated the virus from the lungs of rodents near the Hantan River. Then, in 1993, the virus made global headlines again with a sudden, deadly outbreak of the pulmonary syndrome among the Navajo population in the United States. So this is a pathogen that has been quietly coexisting with human civilization for a very, very long time. Section 5. Past cases in Turkey. The local picture. So we've looked at South Korea, the Americas, and Argentina. But what about the local picture right here in Turkey? How was this global virus manifested historically within our own borders? If we look at the geographical concentration mapped out in a really comprehensive clinical study from the Clinic Journal, we can clearly see the footprint of Turkey's first major clinically and serologically confirmed hantavirus outbreak. This happened between 2009 and 2010. Notice that intense clustering? The spots marked in dark orange and red? That's all up in the Black Sea region, specifically concentrated around the Zonguldak and Bartın provinces. Let's unpack the details of that specific Turkish outbreak because it's pretty fascinating. Researchers successfully isolated two specific strains from the local rodent populations there, the Pumala and Dobra viruses. And remember, both of those cause the renal syndrome we discussed earlier. But here's a truly wild clinical quirk. During diagnosis, the standard PCR testing, which is what usually looks for the genetic material of the virus, was unexpectedly completely negative across the board. Doctors actually had to rely on other methods, like ELISA and neutralization tests, just to confirm the virus was there. It's a stark reminder of just how tricky viral diagnostics can be, and why multi-method testing is absolutely crucial for accurate epidemiology. Now, regarding the present day, following those recent WHO cruise ship alerts in 2026, the Turkish Ministry of Health quickly released a statement. They confirmed that they are monitoring the global situation rigorously, and there are currently 0 active cases detected within Turkey. So you can definitely take a deep breath there. Which brings us to our final thought. We've seen today that hantavirus is an ancient pathogen, one that relies heavily on the delicate boundary between human infrastructure and rodent habitats. And we know that environmental changes are actively blurring that boundary. So as our changing climate and expanding urbanization force rodents and other wildlife into brand new habitats, what other ancient, dormant viral threats might awaken in our own backyards? It's a massive question, and it's one that health organizations globally are racing to answer. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack the source material today. Stay curious, stay informed, and I will catch you in the next explainer.